the Medici.
Chapter 4. Cosimo, Pater Patriae.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
Cosimo, Pater Patriae. Giovanni de' Medici's two sons were Cosimo and Lorenzo. Cosimo's branch, which includes all the greater Medici, eventually in the 7th generation died out when the succession passed to Lorenzo's branch, which carried on the family through 6 more generations, attained that crown which the elder branch had striven for and made possible, and at last in its turn also died out in 1743. As the best way of avoiding confusion, the history follows the elder branch right down to its end, Part 1, before returning to take up Part 2, the story of the younger branch, from its commencement with Lorenzo downwards. This is rendered the easier since the first few generations of the younger branch have scarcely any independent history of their own, theirs being almost entirely merged in that of the elder branch, so that the period when the younger branch has an independent history is a comparatively short one. Chapter 4. Cosimo, Pater Patriae. Born 1389, ruled 1434 to 1464, died 1464. When Giovanni de' Medici died, his eldest son Cosimo was 40 years old. Up to that time we have only one episode recorded of him, viz. That when in 1450 the Council of Constance was assembled, and Pope John XXIII, forced by the Emperor Sigismund, very reluctantly proceeded to it, Cosimo de' Medici, then 26 years old, who had known him before he became Pope, went with him, at the risk of his life, to help to defend him, and had to fly in disguise when Pope John was deposed and imprisoned by the council. Cosimo had shortly before this adventure been married to Contessina di Bardi, and his eldest son Piero was born, apparently in the Bardi palace, while Cosimo was absent at the above council. The Bardi were in the 14th century the richest banking family in Florence. Though they themselves have disappeared, their oldest palace still stands in the street, which was once their property, and still bears their name, the Via de' Bardi, always to us reminiscent of Romola. But they had fallen on evil days before Cosimo's marriage to the eldest daughter of the house, having been gradually ruined, owing to the loss of a large sum of money which, lent by them to Edward III of England, had never been repaid. By this marriage the Bardi palace came into the possession of the Medici family, and Cosimo appears during his father's lifetime to have lived there, his arms, with 8 red balls, being still to be seen in some of the rooms. Cosimo had been educated at the celebrated school attached to the Camaldolese monastery of Santa Maria degli Angeli in the Via degli Alfani. He knew Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic, besides several modern languages, and was passionately fond of both learning and art. He also possessed all the qualities which distinguished his father, and on becoming head of the family soon showed that he would be likely to play a more prominent part in Florentine affairs than his father. The family were by this time growing enormously wealthy, owning banks in as many as 16 capital cities in Europe, and Cosimo's great wealth, courteous demeanour, ability, and tact, all joined as it was to a generous disposition, made him fully as popular with the people as his father had been. In Cosimo de' Medici, the party of the nobles, the Grandi, then headed by the powerful family of the Albizzi, saw a formidable opponent. They already detested this wealthy family, who were rising from the class of the Popolani and gaining such influence, and they saw in its new head one who aroused their bitterest jealousy. They therefore determined that the Medici must be entirely rooted out of Florence. This, however, was not easy to accomplish, Cosimo's popularity being so great. Moreover, the most respected of their number, the aged Niccolò de Uzzano, was against any such design. Machiavelli tells us that when the other nobles consulted him regarding their proposed action against the Medici, he warned them that in a trial of strength the latter would win, that if Cosimo were put to death as they desired, Florence would be in danger of having Rinaldo degli Albizzi as a despot, and that if either was to prevail of the two, he preferred Cosimo. But, he added, God deliver this city from private usurpation, so that for the present the nobles were forced to bide their time. In 1430, 2 years after his father's death, Cosimo began to carry out a project which he had had under consideration from the time he succeeded his father, that of building a new palace for the family. For this he chose a site in the Via Larga, the widest street in the city, at the corner where it was joined by a short street, the Via de' Gori, which ran down to the church of San Lorenzo, then being rebuilt with the family money, and which, when completed, he purposed to endow. This palace Cosimo intended should be a model of architectural art, and should surpass anything of the kind at that time seen. Brunelleschi was now the foremost architect of the age. His dome was approaching completion. He was also building the church of San Lorenzo, and in the same year began his other church of Santo Spirito, so Cosimo had at first proposed to employ him in designing his new palace. But on seeing Brunelleschi's plan, he considered it too grand in character, and instead of it accepted a less pretentious one by Michelozzo, an architect then coming into notice, and who, chiefly through this work, became recognized as second only to Brunelleschi. For the adornment of the cortile of the palace, when it should be completed, Cosimo gave various commissions to Donatello, by this time acknowledged as the leading sculptor. These included the bronze statue of David, now in the Museum of the Bargello, the bronze statue of Judith slaying Holofernes, now in the Loggia de Lanzi, and the medallions copied from antique gems, still to be seen over the arches of the cortile. The first of these works, the David, was an epoch-making statue in the history of art, having probably a greater influence than any other single statue ever executed. It was finished within the next 3 years, before Cosimo's exile, the other commissions being completed later. In 1432, Niccolò da Uzzano, for so many years the respected leader of the Nobili, though latterly thrown into the shade by Rinaldo degli Albizzi, died. He was one of the best statesmen Florence had ever possessed, consistently employing his influence to check the party rivalries of his countrymen. His restraining influence being removed, the nobles proceeded to carry out their resolve to get rid of these Medici who were becoming such formidable champions of the people. Complete success in this object required, they considered, the death of Cosimo himself and the banishment of the rest of the family, including his brother Lorenzo and their first cousin Averardo. In the case of a family of bankers, such a banishment, particularly if they were dispersed, would soon cause their ruin. With the Albizzi family at their head, the Nobili now took steps to effect these objects, and the new palace, so much superior to any hitherto built in Florence, assisted them in their design, now that the walls began to attain sufficient height for the general style of the building to be appreciated, and particularly the novel and expensive rustica style of the lower story. Having, by a skilful manipulation of the elections of the year 1433, obtained a signoria considerably under their influence, the Albizzi party accused Cosimo to the government of scheming to exalt himself above the rank of an ordinary citizen, the worst charge possible in Florence, and pointed, among other things, to the new palace as being too grand for a simple citizen, denoting an ambition dangerous to the Republic. Whereupon Cosimo was suddenly arrested and consigned to a cell in the tower of the Palazzo della Signoria, while arrangements were made for his speedy judicial murder. But the temper of the populace, when they heard what was going on, became so formidable that plan had, after a day or two, to be abandoned. The nobles then attempted to employ poison, and commissioned 2 of their number to effect this. Cosimo had from the first expected that this method would be employed, and for the first 3 days of his imprisonment would eat nothing. But the second plan also failed, as Cosimo's jailer, Federico Malavonte, refused to be corrupted. So the nobles had to be content with his banishment, but Cosimo had a narrow escape. In due course a sentence of banishment was passed by the Signoria, a regular decree of ostracism in the Greek style being drawn up. The whole of the Medici were exiled, Cosimo and his family to Padua, his brother Lorenzo to Venice, and his cousin Everardo to Naples, and they were escorted under a guard to the frontier. The decree declared that the Medici were banished from the city and state of Florence, being dangerous to the Republic by reason of their wealth and ambition. The sentence of exile and the reasons for it were published in all other states, so as to make their disgrace as public as possible, and the nobles, though they had failed to secure Cosimo's death, were satisfied that they had nevertheless achieved the ruin of the Medici. Thus were the Medici for the first time cast forth in ignominy by Florence as foes to her republic. It was an experience they were to undergo 3 times in the course of their history. On this first occasion it occurred solely to satisfy the desire of the nobles to get rid of the one family that stood in the way of a return to that state of things wherein the power had been in the hands of the nobles, an object the latter had never ceased to work for since the reform of the constitution, which had placed all power in the hands of the people. It is often asserted that the germs of an aim to destroy the Republic and erect a despotic monarchy in its place existed in the Medici from the first. But so far, at all events, as this first banishment is concerned, the statement is proved in the most practical manner to be untrue. For whereas suspicions of this nature, when once aroused, have, if there be any basis for them, a tendency to grow stronger in the absence of the accused, and certainly would do so in such a city, yet in this case the very reverse occurred, and Florence by her action a year afterwards conclusively proved that there were no grounds for the charge. By Cosimo's exile the work on the Medici Palace was brought to a standstill, and as neither Michelozzo nor Donatello desired to remain in a city which had cast him out, they also went into exile, Michelozzo accompanying Cosimo and Donatello proceeding to Rome, to study such remains of the classic sculpture as were to be found there, though these were at the time extremely few, the popes not having begun to collect such things, and all the treasures now to be seen in the sculpture galleries of the Vatican and the Capitol then lying buried under the ruins of the devastated city. Contemporary historical events 1428 to 1433. The chief events during the first 5 years after Cosimo became head of the family were the great change which at this time came over the long struggle between France and England, known as the 100 Years' War, and the assembly of the Council of Bâle, the third of the attempts of the 15th century to reform the Church. Also, on a smaller stage, Florence's 2 wars against Lucca and against Milan. Regarding the first of the above events, it has been noted how, in 1428, the English, then masters of all northern France, advanced southwards and laid siege to Orleans. Then came Joan of Arc, and in 3 years, 1428 to 1431, changed the whole aspect of affairs in France. The details of her career, ending in her death, which was to the lasting disgrace of both English and French, are well known. The English power in France never recovered the blow dealt it by her victories, and from this time forth the English were steadily driven backwards. In 1431, the same year that Joan of Arc was burnt at Rouen, the Council of Bâle was assembled. In that year, Martin V, the Pope, who had been elected at the Council of Constance, died. He had revived the autocratic view of the papacy, which had been maintained by the popes of the 13th century, had ruled that archbishops and bishops are merely the delegates of the pope, and had endeavoured to prevent all further assembling of councils to reform the church, by ruling that popes were superior to councils. It was a strange outcome of the work of such a council as that of Constance. However, on his death his rulings were ignored, and a third attempt to reform the church was made by the assembly of the Council of Basle. It was convened, like that of Constance, by the Emperor Sigismund. The new pope, Eugenius IV, having failed in his endeavour to prevent its meeting, or to get it dissolved as soon as the preliminary proceedings were concluded, was, through fear of being deposed, at length forced to acknowledge that a pope is subject to a council, and sent 4 cardinals to represent him at it. This council was sitting at Basle from 1431 to 1438. It passed various decrees of reform, which the pope accepted. Then, as it proceeded to deal stronger blows at the papacy, the pope tried to remove it to Italy. The council, however, refused to be removed. Its subsequent dealings with Pope Eugenius IV will be noted hereafter. During the years 1429 to 1433, Florence was dragged into 2 small wars, which brought her much discredit. The Albizzi, wielding the chief influence, first persuaded the government to enter on an unjust aggressive war against Lucca, and then prosecuted this war with such an utter want of ability that it was no wonder that it was completely unsuccessful. And Florence, in this attempt to conquer Lucca, reaped nothing but expense, failure, and loss of prestige. This war produced one with Milan, which languished on undecisively until 1433, when a temporary peace was patched up. These 2 wars, whose only result was an increased expenditure, brought much disfavour upon the Albizzi, who were entirely responsible for them. Cosimo, 1434. The first exile of the Medici lasted only for 1 year. The large majority of the population loved this munificent and gracious family, and by the time a year had passed, saw that they had been made a cat's paw to assist the manoeuvres of the nobles, and that while there was no ground for the accusation against the Medici, there was every ground for suspecting the motive of the nobles. For the Albizzi and their party, when once they had got rid of the people's main supporter, proceeded, by their scarcely concealed plotting against the democratic form of the government, which Florence had gained through so many struggles, to give the people good reason for such fears. So in September 1434 the decree of banishment against the Medici was annulled, and messages were sent inviting their return. The Albizzi thereupon flew to arms, assembled their adherents to the number of about 800, and made an attempt to seize the government before Cosimo should return. But the Signoria obtained troops from Pistoia, and the attempt failed. On the 6th of October, Cosimo re-entered Florence with a public triumph, almost like that given to a conqueror, and in the midst of a rejoicing populace. Machiavelli says, "Seldom has a citizen returning from a great victory been greeted by such a concourse of people, and with such demonstrations of affection, as was Cosimo on his return from exile." And Cosimo's unassuming demeanour, even on the occasion of so honourable a triumph over his enemies, increased still further his popularity. His subsequent conduct did him equal honour. In any other state in Europe at that time of the world's history, such a return to power would assuredly have been followed by the putting to death of those whose enmity had caused what had been endured. Cosimo and his whole family had been treated with the bitterest animosity by the nobles, and with the greatest ingratitude by those members of the Signoria whom the nobles had induced to do their will. The humiliation of himself and his family had been made known in all the surrounding states. They had been put to much fear, inconvenience, and loss. His own life had been attempted, and nothing had been omitted to secure the total ruin of his family. Yet, when thus triumphantly brought back by the will of the people with ample power to retaliate, we find Cosimo firmly refusing to allow any of those who had caused these things to be put to death. On the other hand, that some should suffer banishment on account not of what had been done to the Medici, but of the attempt which had been made before their return to overthrow the government, was inevitable. The Albizzi and their party could not expect to get off unpunished after such an endeavour. Those writers who are anxious to find cause against the Medici have accused Cosimo of a vindictive policy on this occasion, but this is unjust. The Signoria, terribly frightened at the attempt, which had nearly succeeded, of the Albizzi and their party to seize the government by force of arms, passed a sentence of exile against some 80 of them. It was not an unnatural result of their conduct, but in any case there is no evidence that this and other repressive measures against the Albizzi party, some of which measures had been already taken before his arrival, were instigated by Cosimo at all. A few months after the above triumphant return, Cosimo received from his city the most practical demonstration it could give of its entire revulsion of sentiment towards him, and regret for the treatment which he and his had received. He was elected Gonfaloniere, and held that office for the next 2 months. Contemporary historical events 1433 to 1434. Meanwhile, Pope Eugenius IV had become involved in many troubles, mainly through his continued opposition to the Council of Bâle. The Emperor Sigismund, at length being determined to force the Pope to submit to the reforms which the Council was striving to pass, but which the Pope's delegates were obstructing, proceeded to Italy, being invited thither by Filippino Visconti, Duke of Milan, who hoped that the Emperor would assist him in the war he was then carrying on against Florence and Venice. After staying for some time with the Duke of Milan, and after being crowned with the Iron Crown of Lombardy, the Emperor, avoiding Florence's territory, proceeded by way of Lucca and Siena to Rome, where he was crowned by Pope Eugenius in St. Peter's in 1433. Thence he started on his way back to Bâle, apparently less ready than he had hitherto been to support the council against the Pope. But immediately afterwards, Fortebraccio, commander of the Milanese troops, marched upon Rome, while at the same time Francesco Sforza, also in behalf of the Duke of Milan, seized a large part of the papal territories in Romagna, declaring that he was authorized to do so by the Council of Bâle. The eventual result was that Pope Eugenius was, in 1434, forced to fly from Rome in disguise and in danger of his life, the people of Rome joining with his other foes in expelling him. He took refuge at Florence, arriving there just at the time of Cosimo's recall from exile, and at Florence this pope resided for the next 8 years, while Rome remained in possession of his enemies. Cosimo, at the time of his recall from banishment in 1434, was 45 years of age, and thenceforth became the acknowledged leading citizen of the Florentine Republic. But knowing well the fickle nature of popular favour and the peculiar temperament of his countrymen, their habit of constant change, their tendency to fall a prey to one faction after another, and above all their jealousy of any individual who seemed inclined to exalt himself, he saw that an immense task lay before him if he was to retain that position. It has generally been assumed that Cosimo was actuated solely by personal ambition, but he had other motives than this. Apart from all question of personal or family ambition, he desired to retain that position for 2 reasons eminently honourable to him. The poorer classes were ground down under a crushing burden of taxation, due to the heavy cost to each individual citizen of wars so constantly undertaken by a state whose population was comparatively small. This evil he desired to remedy by so guiding foreign affairs as to make such wars less frequent. Again he saw that the same cause was severely hampering Florence's commerce, while, as a banker on a wide scale, he felt that if he could create peace, he would be able considerably to extend Florentine markets and increase the commercial wealth of the Florentines. Feeling that he possessed in himself the ability to do these things, it was in every way natural that he should wish to show that he could do them. Ambition of this kind is not a fault, but a virtue. But to do all this he must be Florence's leading citizen, no matter who might from time to time be gonfalonier, and in order to retain permanently this position, one which could never be more than tacitly granted, two things would be necessary. First, to make all foreign countries recognize that he, and he alone, was the motive power in the Florentine state, and second, to convince his own countrymen that no one else could so satisfactorily manage their affairs, and in particular their foreign affairs, so that they should be glad to leave all such matters in his hands. And both these things must be done in such a way as never to arouse in the Florentines that peculiar jealousy of any kind of authority which they were so apt to develop. Such was the task before Cosimo, one at which any man might have quailed, in view of the temperament of the Florentine people of his time, as well as the conditions of perpetual intrigue in the midst of which it must be carried out. Yet, as will be seen in the sequel, he accomplished with complete success this difficult task. But it was not only in the political sphere that Cosimo won renown. Many and varied were the matters which he took in hand for the advancement of learning, the encouragement of art, and the assistance of charitable institutions. Before all else he was a deep scholar, one of those who loved learning for its own sake. He maintained a regular staff of agents, always employed in searching in the East for rare and important manuscripts, which became the nucleus of the great library which he founded. He instituted the celebrated Platonic Academy for the study of the rediscovered Plato, of whose writings he was an enthusiastic admirer. No scholar applied to him in vain, and the ways in which he promoted the cause of learning were numberless. Gibbon says of him, "Cosimo was the father of a line of princes whose name and age are almost synonymous with the restoration of learning. His credit was ennobled into fame. His riches were dedicated to the service of mankind. He corresponded at once with Cairo and London, and a cargo of Indian spices and Greek books were often imported in the same vessel." To art he gave similar assistance. He was a liberal patron to the painters Fra Angelico and Lippi, to the sculptors Ghiberti and Donatello, and to the architects Brunelleschi and Michelozzo. He collected objects of art of every kind, and he made his collections open to all artists. No less lavish were his charities. He gave large sums for the rebuilding of many churches and monasteries, including the Badia of Fiesole, the monastery of San Marco, and the church of San Lorenzo, built a hospital at Jerusalem for sick and infirm pilgrims, and bore a large part in every charitable work undertaken in Florence. Such was the man who, in 1434, became the leading citizen of the Florentine Republic, and set forth on the political task which has been mentioned. In 1435, Francesco Sforza, the celebrated condottiere commander, visited Florence. During this visit he developed a great liking for Cosimo, and thus began that friendship between them which, in after years, had important political results. In 1436, Brunelleschi completed his dome, and the cathedral, begun 138 years before by Arnolfo di Cambio, was at last finished. This completion of the great work upon which 4 generations had laboured was a notable event, and a ceremony worthy of the occasion was arranged. Pope Eugenius IV was at this time residing at the monastery of Santa Maria Novella, and the cathedral was solemnly consecrated by him on the feast of the Annunciation, 25th March 1436. A raised passage, richly carpeted and decorated with tapestry, damask, silk, and flowers, was constructed from the door of the Santa Maria Novella, and passing through the baptistry to the western door of the cathedral. Along this an imposing procession, consisting of the Pope, 37 bishops, 7 cardinals, the Signoria, and the envoys of foreign powers, passed from Santa Maria Novella to the cathedral. The consecration ceremony occupied 5 hours, after which the procession was reformed and returned in the same way. A tablet on the wall of the cathedral commemorates this event. Brunelleschi, more fortunate than Giotto, lived to see the completion of his great work and to take part in the above ceremony. The completion of the dome and the consecration of the cathedral served to mark the beginning of Cosimo's rule in Florence. In 1437, Cosimo set about rebuilding at his own expense the afterwards far-famed monastery of San Marco in Florence. This monastery of the Dominican order had at this time in its community 2 men who will ever live enshrined in the memory of men as representing all that was best in the spirit of that age, and as counterbalancing much that was evil. Giovanni of Fiesole, called Fra Angelico, and Antonio Pierozzi, called Antonino, afterwards Archbishop of Florence. Situated near the new palace which he was building, its prior, a man so justly beloved, this monastery seems to have been looked upon by Cosimo as a well-beloved retreat to which he could retire for rest and congenial companionship when harassed by the cares of state and the vexations of political life. And with his usual liberality in all that he undertook, he spent money upon it, with a generosity which the modesty of the friars had to restrain. The rebuilding of it cost him 36,000 ducats, in addition to which sum he gave it a large endowment. He had a special cell set apart for his own use, and thither often resorted for converse with the prior and others of the community. He gave as a nucleus for the monastery library over 400 valuable manuscript books, and it was at his expense that the walls of the monastery were decorated with those frescoes by Fra Angelico, which all the world now visits San Marco to see. Art, 1434 to 1439. The effect of having at the head of the state a man like Cosimo showed itself at once in the impetus given to all branches of art. As a result, we find art taking great strides during those first 5 years of Cosimo's supremacy in Florentine affairs, and artists at work all over the city whose names have since become famous throughout the world. Ghiberti was employed on his 2nd pair of bronze doors. Brunelleschi was engaged on his 2 churches of San Lorenzo and Santo Spirito, besides several palaces. Michelozzo was at work on the Medici Palace and the monastery of San Marco. Donatello, having returned from Rome, was busy in San Lorenzo and on his various works for Cosimo's new palace. The dead Misaccio's name was earning great fame, for by this time men had recognized his genius, and all painters were eagerly studying his works in the Brancacci chapel. Luca della Robbia was completing his marble screen of the Cantoria. Fra Angelico was beginning his frescoes in San Marco. Lippi was painting pictures for Cosimo, in which he was to show the world the lessons which Masaccio had taught. Andrea del Casagno, Domenico Veneziano, Paolo Uccello, and many other artists were at work in Florence, most of them brought thither directly by Cosimo to execute various works for him, while he was besieged with letters by others at a distance importuning him for commissions. Contemporary historical events, 1434 to 1439. From 1434 to 1436, Florence was again at war with Milan, Filippo Visconti, Duke of Milan, being stirred up to attack Florence's territory by the banished Rinaldo degli Albizzi and his party, who urged the Duke to make war on Florence, promising to aid him with a contingent of furositi and by fomenting insurrection within the city. At length, however, in February 1437, Florence gained a victory over the forces of Milan at the Battle of Barga, which for a time put a stop to Milan's efforts, whereupon Florence again attacked Lucca, but without any success. Milan, however, renewed the war in 1438, and it dragged on with varying success for several years without definite result. In the year 1437 the Emperor Sigismund died, and immediately upon this Pope Eugenius IV came to an open breach with the Council of Bâle, and summoned a fresh council to meet in Italy, the place chosen being Ferrara. Its main object was to consider proposals made at this time by the Eastern Emperor. The Emperor John Palaeologus, following the example of his father and grandfather, proposed making a personal visit to the West to solicit help against the Turks to save Constantinople, which must otherwise fall. The Pope invited him, together with the Patriarch and bishops of the Eastern Church, to a conference, holding out hopes of such aid if the breach between the churches of the East and the West could be healed. Upon this action on the Pope's part of convening on his own authority a fresh council to meet in Italy, a step he had never been permitted to effect so long as the Emperor Sigismund lived, the Council of Bâle, refusing to be thus broken up, declared Pope Eugenius deposed. But the feeling of Europe was against the creation of another schism, and by degrees the Council of Bâle dwindled away and came to an end, after having sat for 8 years and effected practically nothing towards that reformation of the Church for which it had been assembled. Thus again did the last reforming council, for it was the last, fail as completely as the two which had preceded it. Meanwhile, the Emperor John Palaeologus and his retinue, together with the Patriarch of Constantinople, Joseph, and a numerous body of bishops and theologians, sailed from Constantinople and in due time arrived at Venice. The Emperor was received with great pomp by Doge Francesco Foscari and entertained at Venice for a month, after which he proceeded to Ferrara, where Pope Eugenius having also arrived, the council began its sittings, 5th of January 1438. Cosimo, in that task which has been mentioned, of gradually bringing foreign nations to recognise in him the motive power of the Florentine state, and also gradually convincing his countrymen that their interests were best served by leaving foreign affairs to him, had had to exercise much patience. He had a matter to effect which necessarily moved but slowly, and during the first few years he had been forced to be content with a very partial control, and often been obliged to acquiesce in action which he was as yet without the power to direct as he would wish. But by the end of the year 1438 he was beginning to have this power, foreign affairs being more and more left to him to manage in his own way, and he now took his first independent step, one which had very important results to Florence. He proceeded to Ferrara, where the council between the Eastern and Western churches had been sitting for nearly a year, and so used his influence with Pope Eugenius IV that he got the council transferred to Florence, whereby he obtained for his city increased political influence, brought to it much added trade, and secured for it additional advantages in the advancement of the cause of learning. Accordingly, the council removed in February 1439 from Ferrara to Florence, which thus became the centre of interest in this great historical event. The Council of Florence, 1439. This council is one of the most interesting assemblages of this kind that ever took place, a gathering which included an emperor of the East and his retinue, a patriarch of Constantinople, the principal authorities of the Eastern Church, a Pope of Rome, the principal authorities of the Western Church, and all the most learned men of both East and West had never before been seen. Moreover, it was the last occasion on which such an assemblage was possible. 14 years later, the fall of Constantinople swept away all that formed its peculiar interest, making it impossible for such a gathering ever to occur again. This occasion gave Cosimo a great opportunity, both in the political sphere and with regard to the cause of learning, nor did he allow the cost of entertaining these distinguished visitors to fall upon the state, but made them all his own guests, an action which gained him universal commendation. Residences were provided for them such as they could not have obtained in any other city. The Patriarch of Constantinople was lodged in the Ferrantini Palace in the Borgo Pinti, the Pope and his suite in the extensive range of buildings at that time attached to Santa Maria Novella, while to the Emperor and his retinue were given the whole of the Peruzzi palaces, then surrounding the Piazza del Peruzzi, a group of palaces in which the Eastern Emperor and his suite were more splendidly lodged than they could have been in the dwelling of any prince in Europe. The council began its sittings on the 2nd of March. It sat in the cathedral, beneath Brunelleschi's glorious dome, at that time the wonder of Italy, and worthy to be first used on so unique an occasion. This gathering gave an immense impetus to what was beginning to be called the New Learning. It brought to Florence the most learned churchmen of Eastern Christendom, such as Bessarion, Bishop of Nicaea, and also the most learned scholars of the East, such as Gemistos Plethon, whom Cosimo induced to settle permanently at Florence. It brought many rare manuscripts, most of which found their way into Cosimo's library, and above all it created personal contact and friendliness destined to have large results when a few years later this Greek learning should find itself driven from its home in Constantinople. The effect of all this was to advance Florence still further on that path of unearthing the long-buried literature of the past, on which Cosimo's efforts had already been long engaged. And this new learning, among many results which it was to have in the future, was to have one result of which men little dreamed, and least of all those most occupied in fostering the cause of learning. For it was destined in time to produce that great convulsion extending over all Europe, which we know as the Reformation. The new learning operated in two different ways to produce this result. First, in its work of increasing a knowledge of the ancient literature, it opened up large tracts of history till then scarcely known. It made scholars acquainted with writings belonging to the centuries preceding the dark period before the time of Charlemagne, writings hitherto accessible, if at all, only to ecclesiastics, and able to be read only by a few even of the latter. A large number of these writings referred to church matters, and had been written by eminent bishops of that period, and these soon disclosed to scholars that during at least 6 centuries of the Church's earliest life its constitution had been very different from what they now saw it, and with no supremacy of one see over all others, while such writings also made them acquainted with the proceedings of the 6 great general councils of the Church, which had taken place in those centuries, some of which councils had given decisions bearing on this very point. And to this new knowledge of the history of the Church the gathering in Florence added considerably, for it enabled the dignitaries of the Eastern Church to converse face to face and in their own language with inquirers on such subjects belonging to the West. And since the Eastern Church prided itself on never deviating by one hair's breadth from what was held at the beginning, and since the special point upon which the discussions of the Council were taking place was this very one of the claim of the Church of Rome to a supremacy which the Eastern Church maintained did not exist at the beginning, the Eastern bishops and theologians gathered at Florence would be certain to corroborate any discoveries on the above point which the new learning might reveal to the eager scholars of Florence. And what scholars learnt in one generation, all mankind would, through them, learn in the next. Pope Eugenius, therefore, in bringing the bishops and theologians of the Eastern Church into contact with the hotbed of learning which was growing up in Florence, had done the most fatal thing he could do to the cause of the papacy. Moreover, the time was soon to come when one of these scholars of the Renaissance, poring in some dim library over the documents of the 8th century, would make the amazing discovery that the so-called donation of Constantine and the celebrated decretals, now known as the forged decretals, upon which the whole claim of the See of Rome to a supremacy had been based, were nothing less than a series of immense forgeries. As the general result of all this, the new learning, which now received so strong an impetus, was bound, as soon as it should spread to Germany and England, and as soon as the invention of printing should come to aid it in doing so, to produce the Reformation. The process would take time, but the effect was certain. Where the councils of Pisa, Constance, and Bâle had failed, the new learning would assuredly not fail. It was a train of gunpowder laid in an ever-widening circle from Florence as a centre, though the man was not yet born whose hand would, 80 years later, far away in Germany, eventually set fire to the train. The second way in which the new learning tended to the same result was of a different kind. It gave a strong impulse towards the study of Plato and other non-Christian thinkers of the classical age, and a tendency to look at all religions from their standpoint. And here also this gathering in Florence had much effect. We are told that Cosimo, always a great admirer of Plato's philosophy, formed the idea of his celebrated Platonic Academy from conversing with the Greek scholar Platon, the most learned of the Greeks who came to the council. This famous academy tended to create a sceptical spirit, and though many of its members made endeavours to reconcile Platonism and Christianity, yet its general tendency was against the existing order of things in religion. Its influence became, later on, very widespread, and Symonds says that it would be impossible to overestimate the influence upon European thought which this Platonic Academy came to exercise about the time of the Reformation. In Italy, through Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, and in Germany through Reuchlin and his pupil Melanchthon. This great gathering of 1439 in Florence had its effect also on art. We are often inclined to wonder where such painters as Fra Angelico, Benozzo Gozzoli, and Gentile da Fabriano got the idea of the gorgeous robes and strange-looking headdresses which we see in their pictures of Eastern subjects. It was all taken direct from the life of Florence of this year. During that summer, the inhabitants of Florence saw a perpetual succession of grand processions and imposing functions in which these visitors from the East appeared in every kind of magnificent and strange costume. Vespasiano da Bisticci and other writers of the time dilate upon their rich silken robes heavy with gold and their fantastic-looking headdresses, regarded with deep interest by the learned on account of their ancient character, and the painters reproduce these before us in pictorial records, which are valuable to us on that very account, and because this was the last occasion on which these costumes were destined to appear. As regards the objects with which the Council of Florence was assembled, no results followed. The venerable Patriarch of Constantinople, Joseph, died in Florence 1 month before the council came to an end. After his death, an agreement between the Greek and Latin churches was made by the council and published with much ostentation by the Pope. But the basis of it was that submission of the Eastern Church to the Church of Rome, which had been an aim of the papacy ever since the 10th century, and the failure of any agreement from that standpoint was a foregone conclusion. The emperor, on the termination of the council, returned at once to Constantinople, and as soon as the terms of the agreement he had made became known, it was violently repudiated by the entire population, and a tumult so great arose that the agreement made at Florence was forthwith dropped and never heard of again. Thus the emperor, John Palaiologos, the third in succession to strive to get help from the West to save Constantinople, was no more successful than his father and grandfather had been. It was evidently vain to hope that the nations of Europe could be induced to lay aside their mutual dissensions, even to protect themselves from a danger which threatened them all, and the days of the great capital of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which had blocked the path of Mohammedan conquest for 800 years, were now plainly numbered. In 1440, shortly after the above concourse had dispersed, and Florence had returned to her normal conditions, the palace in the Via Larga, which Cosimo had begun to build in 1430, was sufficiently completed for occupation, and he moved into it. The members of the family who were thus the first to take up their abode in this palace, to which so much of the after-history of the Medici attaches, were Cosimo and his wife, Contessina, and their two sons, Piero and Giovanni, then respectively 24 and 19 years old. A few years later, both the latter were to marry and bring their wives also to live in the family palace, which, before Cosimo's death, echoed to the childish voices of yet a third generation. Cosimo's brother, Lorenzo, died just as this change of residence of the elder branch took place. In the same year, the long and desultory war with Milan was brought to a conclusion. The Milanese army, under Piccinino, after threatening Florence, retired into the Casentino, where, being followed by the Florentine army, it was defeated at the Battle of Anghiari, by which success Florence gained the fertile district of the Casentino, and Venice, her ally, gained Peschiera and Bergamo. In the following year, 1441, there occurred an incident out of which has originated an accusation against Cosimo of the gravest kind, to the effect that he instigated the murder of Baldaccio d'Anghiari, commander of the Florentine infantry. The crime was an atrocious one, but there is not a particle of evidence that Cosimo had anything to do with it. During the war with Milan in 1440, a Florentine named Orlandini was in command of the troops which had been stationed to hold the important pass of Marradi on the Faenza road, a strong position covering Florence on the north, and between which and Florence there were no other troops. The Milanese army, under Piccinino, having failed in their attack on the pass of San Benedetto, then attempted to force that of Marradi, where they should have been still more easily repulsed, but on the approach of the enemy Orlandini had ignominiously fled, ordering his troops to do the same, thereby leaving the road to Florence open to the enemy, who advanced and occupied the heights of Fiesole, placing Florence for a short time in grave danger. And Baldaccio d'Anghiari, being a brave soldier, had boldly denounced Orlandini's cowardice, which had had such serious results. In 1441, Orlandini became gonfaloniere, and while holding that office, sent for Baldaccio, under the garb of friendship, to come and discuss some military affairs at the Palazzo della Signoria. The latter accordingly went to the palace, was received by the gonfaloniere with every sign of friendship, and conducted by him to his own room, where, on a sudden, hired assassins, placed in concealment by Orlandini, rushed upon Baldaccio and killed him, throwing his body into the cortile below. His head was cut off, and his mangled remains exposed to the public in the Piazza della Signoria, where it was proclaimed that he had been put to death by the Signoria as a traitor to the Republic. The accusation against Cosimo is that Baldaccio, on his way to the palace, happened to meet him, and asked his advice about going, and that Cosimo treacherously advised him to go, it being declared that Cosimo desired Baldaccio's death, because he feared the growing influence of Neri Capone, whose close friend Baldaccio was. The motive alleged is exceedingly lame, while the whole story of Baldaccio's having met Cosimo at all, or received any advice from him, is apparently due solely to political animosity. It is only mentioned by one historian of the time, Cavalcanti, whose hatred of Cosimo is well known. And as the story is not mentioned by any other writer, and comes from a source so unreliable in this particular case, it is now rejected by all historians as unworthy of credence. Gino Capone, in similarly rejecting it, says that Cavalcanti always writes in hatred of Cosimo while wishing to appear not to do so. Some writers have urged that even if Cosimo did not instigate the crime, he must be held no less responsible, since he took no action against those guilty of it. But this ignores the fact that the latter were not private individuals, but the government of the country, that, at the date when this occurred, 1441, Cosimo had by no means yet gained the degree of power he afterwards attained, and that any action by him against the Signoria under the circumstances would have been at any rate highly unconstitutional, and would practically have been to head a rebellion against the constituted authority of the state. Lastly, the crime is so opposed to the whole tenor of his life that we are justified in rejecting absolutely the idea that he had any part in it, especially as the charge is entirely unsupported by any evidence. Nor, except for the desire to find material for a damning charge against Cosimo, does the crime appear to differ from many others common at that time. The facts of the case are amply sufficient to account for Orlandini's deed, while he probably had reason to know that the members of the Signoria were not men likely to refuse to support his action before the people, backed as that action was by the evidence of traitorous conduct which he asserted that he possessed against Baldaccio d'Anghiari. In the same year, 1441, Cosimo arranged the purchase by Florence from the Pope of the town of Borgo San Sepolcro for a sum of 25,000 florins, while we are told Cosimo increased the obligation of the state to him in the matter in that he himself advanced the purchase money. In 1443, Pope Eugenius IV was at last able to return to Rome. Rome was at this time a ruined city, devastated by the long conflicts between the Orsini, the Colonna, and other great barons, and destitute of all culture or civilizing influences, and the contrast was all the more severe to the Pope, since Florence, where he had been living for 8 years, was in advance of all other cities in Europe. The Medici Library. In 1444, Cosimo founded the celebrated Medici Library, the first public library to exist in Europe, and from the example of which the Vatican Library at Rome was 30 years afterwards formed. This library, housed at first in their own palace, was steadily added to by the Medici family in succeeding generations, and by them in 1524 the building in which it is now located, in the cloisters of San Lorenzo, was constructed, designed by Michelangelo. It contains about 10,000 manuscript books of Greek and Latin classical authors, many of them of the rarest value. Among these it possesses the original copy of the Pandects of Justinian, AD 533, the discovery of which in the 12th century caused so great an influence on the civilization of Europe, and on which our study of the Roman law almost entirely hinges. Also the best manuscript of Cicero's letters, 2 manuscripts of Tacitus, one of them being the sole existing copy containing the first 5 books of the Annals, a very ancient copy of the tragedies of Sophocles, a most important manuscript of Aeschylus, a Greek treatise on surgery, the commentaries of Julius Caesar, a Virgil of the 4th century, a Syriac Gospel of AD 556, the Bible copied from 690 to 716 by Colofrid, Abbot of Wearmouth, and called the Codex Amiatinus, a Pliny of the 10th century, and numerous literary treasures connected with the time of Dante and Petrarch and the Florence of the 13th and 14th centuries, the whole representing a vast sum of money spent by the Medici on this splendid contribution towards the advancement of learning. It is the parent of all the great libraries of Europe, and as such deserves to be duly honoured. In connection with this library, it is curious to note how little printing, when, 6 years after this, it appeared, was at first welcomed. Those who owned these rare and costly manuscripts of the past and their beautiful calligraphy looked with no favour on crude and ugly reproductions thereof by a mechanical process. It is recorded by Gregorovius that Federigo Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, a prince who was at this time beginning to follow Cosimo's example in regard to the encouragement of learning and art, would not have a printed book in his library. In 1446 a general war broke out in Italy. As usual, Filippo Visconti, Duke of Milan, was its leading spirit, and he had as his allies the Pope and the King of Naples. Against this powerful coalition were ranged Venice, Florence, Genoa, and Bologna. The latter were entirely successful, especially when Cosimo at length managed to separate Naples from the coalition, and this brought about peace. In the same year Brunelleschi died. Grand funeral obsequies were held in the Duomo, where his body lay surrounded by candles beneath the mighty vault that he had constructed, and was visited by the whole city. He was buried in the Duomo, his monument being placed opposite that of Arnolfo di Cambio, he who began and he who finished thus lying opposite each other in the building which is their joint creation. In 1447 Filippo Visconti, Duke of Milan, the last of the Visconti family and the perpetual enemy of Florence, died, whereupon 2 years of revolutions in Milan followed. Cosimo now executed his greatest stroke of foreign policy. The perpetual state of war with Milan wasted the revenues of Florence and prevented her development. Cosimo therefore determined to entirely change Florence's traditional foreign policy, and instead of Venice for ally and Milan for enemy, to reverse the position. He was opposed by many in his own state who had less political foresight, but he carried his point. Francesco Sforza, the successful soldier, who ever since his visit to Florence in 1435 had maintained a strong friendship with Cosimo, had since married Bianca Visconti, the late Duke's only child. To him Cosimo now gave both political assistance and liberal supplies of money, and as the result of this aid, Sforza, early as 1450, gained possession of Milan and became its duke and Cosimo's fast friend. Venice, of course, was greatly incensed, but Florence had no reason to fear Venice, which was neither so valuable as an ally nor so formidable as a foe as Milan. It proved a most successful stroke of policy, bringing to Florence peace instead of constant wars, and making Cosimo acknowledged as the most powerful force in the politics of Italy. Contemporary historical events, 1440 to 1452. As regards France and England at this time, the 100 Years' War was still proceeding, devastating all northern France, but with the general result that the English were steadily losing their hold of that country. In 1440, Frederick III became emperor. He was destined to hold the imperial title without dignity or influence for over 50 years, 1440 to 1493. In 1447, Pope Eugenius IV died. As his successor, there was elected a man of far greater energy and ability, the eager little scholar, Tommaso Parantuccelli, who was a great friend of Cosimo, and had acted as librarian to the Medici library when it was being formed, and he, on becoming pope, having taken part in all the life of art and learning at work in Florence, was burning to inaugurate a similar state of things in Rome. He took the name of Nicholas V, and, we are told, he determined to make Rome, at this time so desolate and ruined, the metropolis of the world. He took active measures at once, both in the domain of art and in that of learning. In 1450 there was invented at Mayence the art of printing, fraught with greater consequences to mankind than many other events of this time, which then seemed of far greater importance than this at first obscure invention. In 1452 the Emperor Frederick III visited Italy, and on his way to Rome passed through Florence, where he stayed with Cosimo, in the Medici Palace. In the same year, war again broke out in Italy, caused by Alfonso, King of Naples, who, on the death of Filippo Visconti, had taken his place as the disturbing factor in Italy, and who now invaded Florence's territory. In the war that followed, Naples and Venice were ranged against Florence and her new ally Milan. This was the balance of power which Cosimo had with much labour striven to create. It was shown to be thoroughly satisfactory, Venice and Naples being able to effect nothing against Florence and Milan, and after a time, discovering this, they became ready to agree to the peace which through the Pope was proposed and concluded. Pope Nicholas V took no part in the war, urging all states to abandon their feuds and combine against the Turks to prevent the fall of Constantinople, then closely besieged, but none heeded him. Cosimo, 1453. For nearly 20 years, Cosimo's administration of foreign policy had given him unremitting labour, but these efforts of many years had been crowned with success. Notwithstanding many difficulties, he had by degrees brought all foreign countries to realise that he was the motive power in the Florentine state, and he was also, through attaining unvarying success, gradually convinced his own countrymen that no one else could manage their affairs so well, so that they had no desire to see them in other hands. It had required much patient tact to convert his countrymen from their traditional policy of having Venice for friend and Milan for foe, to bring them to see that the contrary policy was the sounder one, to counteract the ill favour against him which, in consequence of his action, Venice endeavoured to stir up in his own city, and to do all this without losing his position in the process. But the successful issue of the war of 1452 convinced all that his view was correct, and left none any longer anxious to dispute his administration of their affairs. And so long as he continued in the same course, and at the same time shunned, as he was wont, all ostentation of power, he might do almost what he would. But Cosimo's political labours did not end even when he had achieved this result. He had to exercise a never-ceasing attention in order so to conduct the foreign policy of Florence amidst the intrigues of the time as to maintain a balance of power among the various Italian states, small as well as large, and thus secure peace in Italy and preserve Florence from the wasting effect of petty wars. The manifold anxieties of such a position were enough to break down any man, and even upon Cosimo they told severely. It was no wonder that he often sought a few hours' retreat from such anxieties in the quiet monastery of San Marco, nor that by the time he was 64 his health had already begun to give way. Contemporary historical events, 1453. In 1453, the 100 Years' War between France and England came to an end. Between the years 1431 and 1453, the English had gradually lost all that they had conquered in France, and when at length, in the latter year, the aged Talbot was killed at the siege of Castillon, this war, which had lasted 116 years, ended. It left the condition of France utterly wretched. From the Loire to the Somme all lay desert, given up to the wolves, and traversed only by the robber and the freelance. But a greater event than the conclusion of this long war, and one whose effects still continue, occurred in the year 1453. This was the fall of Constantinople, bringing to an end the Eastern Empire of Rome on the 29th of May, 1453. It was an event which struck all Europe with horror, for Constantinople was not merely the storehouse of the ancient learning and culture of the Roman Empire, it was also the one great capital city in Europe which had always, from its very birth, been Christian. A city whose foundation had signalized the adoption by the civilized world of that religion, and which had come to be called in the East the Christian city. That such a city should be captured by the Turk, and be henceforth the headquarters of the Mohammedan religion, and of Turkish misrule and tyranny over the Christian populations of the eastern countries, was hateful in the eyes of Europe. And it happened solely because the Western nations were too much occupied with mutual dissensions to combine to prevent it, as 3 successive emperors of the East, in 1361, in 1401, and in 1439, had come in person to implore them to do. The Emperor John Palaeologus had died in 1448 and had been succeeded by his son, the brave young Constantine Palaeologus, the last of the long line of emperors who during 1130 years sat on the throne of Constantine the Great. It was a strange coincidence that the last emperor of Constantinople should have borne the same name as the first. Of Constantine Palaeologus we are told he was in no way inferior to any who ever sat upon that throne. In this final contest he, at any rate, did his part nobly, thereby throwing into deeper contrast the behaviour of the Western nations. Deserted by Europe, with the armies of the Turks all round him, with none but himself to depend upon, with far too small a garrison to defend 13 miles of walls, and a vast crowd of women and children and other non-combatants, the defenceless population of a great city, all looked to him to defend them from the atrocities of the terrible Turks, with every sort of difficulty to be coped with inside the city, whose inhabitants saw themselves abandoned by Christendom. Constantine, solely by his own ability and strength of character, conducted for a year and a half a splendid defence, and in such sort that instead of the ignoble scenes witnessed when Rome fell before Alaric, the manner of the final fall of Constantinople has been felt to be one of the most glorious episodes in all her long history. The immediate consequences of the fall of Constantinople were 4. Intoxicated by their victory, the Turks, wild to press on and subdue the whole of Europe, where Mohammed II now planned to set up at Rome, the capital of a worldwide empire, advanced into Hungary, but there the brave John Huniades barred their way, like another Charles Martel, and they got no further. To the Pope, Nicholas V, who alone had laboured to prevent it, the fall of Constantinople was the cause of the deepest grief. He tried to rouse France, England, Germany, and Venice to retake Constantinople and turn the Turks out of Europe, but what with the incapacity of the Emperor Frederick III and the general disunion between the different countries, he could effect nothing. After 2 years he died, in 1455, it was said, of grief and horror at the capture of the Christian city by the infidel, and at his failure to rouse the Western nations to retake it. To Venice the fall of her rival was her doom. She began to decay from that hour, losing territory after territory to the Turks, and her commerce at the same time. It was a just retribution, for it was the crime of her treacherous attack upon and capture of Constantinople in 1204, committed under the name of a crusade and solely to satisfy her insatiable greed of wealth, which so weakened the Eastern Empire that the decline in power wrought thereby ended, after 250 years of constant defeat, in the final fall of Constantinople, and brought the Turks into Europe. And it was fitting that on Venice should fall the chief punishment. Her wealth rapidly departed. Others, Portugal especially, gained the commerce which she lost, and by the end of the century the decay of the once mighty republic was fully established. To Florence the fall of Constantinople was a gain. It scattered westwards all that accumulation of the ancient learning which Constantinople had so long preserved, most of which naturally gravitated to the city where many of the leading men of Constantinople had been hospitably entertained only 14 years before, and where they knew they would find friends, and this helped forward still further that preeminence in learning and art which was Florence's greatest glory. As to what happened to Constantinople itself, that is best told in a single sentence by a traveller of our own day, who writes, "I have never, in all my travels, grieved so much as at the site of the once beautiful city defiled, squalid, and misgoverned. Cosimo, 1453 to 1463. We have now to look at Cosimo from a financial point of view, at his general as well as his charitable expenditure and the financial arrangements made between the two branches of the family. Cosimo, besides his work in the world of politics, had to administer a great banking business. In this sphere he has, by all writers, been given the reputation of a financier of the first rank. Notwithstanding his immense expenditure, which included private subsidies towards state expenses, the entertainment of distinguished visitors to Florence, large sums given to advance the cause of learning and art, and the equivalent of £1,000,000 given to charitable objects, he more than doubled the fortune inherited from his father, and left his son and successor, Piero, the wealthiest man at that time in Europe. Another feature of his financial work is the way in which he made his operations as a banker assist those connected with his position as head of the state. He frequently made his immense banking transactions a weapon with which to force other countries to the course required for the welfare of Florence. Thus, by his financial assistance, the Venetian Republic were enabled to withstand the united attacks of the French and of Filippo Visconti, Duke of Milan, but on being deprived by Cosimo of this support were unable to do so. Again, in the War of 1452, in which Venice and Naples were allied against Florence, one of the chief means by which Cosimo obtained his success was by calling in such immense debts from those countries that they were deprived of resources for continuing the war. Again, during the War of the Roses, Edward IV obtained such enormous sums from Cosimo's agent in England that he might almost be considered as the means of maintaining that king upon the English throne. As regards charities, the Libro di Ragione shows that Cosimo's private expenditure on churches, monasteries, and charitable institutions exceeded 400,000 gold florins, and this at a time when the whole income of the Florentine state did not reach more than half that sum. About the year 1453, as Cosimo was growing old and his brother Lorenzo was already dead, a computation was made of the family income and a resolution come to between the two branches as to the manner in which the profits of their banking business should be divided between them. The share of these profits, which thus fell to each branch of the family, was equal to about £500,000, an enormous fortune in those times. Cosimo built for his family, besides the Medici Palace in the city itself, various villas outside Florence. The chief of these were Careggi, about 2 miles to the northwest of the city, Cafaggiolo, in the valley of Mugello, and the Villa Medici, on the slope of Fiesole, built by him for his son Giovanni. Careggi was Cosimo's favourite residence, and there he was fond of gathering round him the learned society which he loved. The chief historical events in other countries during the last 10 years of Cosimo's life were the following. In England, 2 years after the 100 Years' War with France had ended, began in 1455 the Wars of the Roses. This kept England in a state of civil war during the next 30 years. As regards the papacy, on the death of Pope Nicholas V in 1455, the Pope elected was Calixtus III. He died in 1458 and was succeeded by the celebrated Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, Pius II, the chief episodes of whose life are depicted in the series of fresco pictures by Pinturicchio in the library of the Cathedral of Siena. This pope paid a visit to Florence in 1460 and stayed with Cosimo in the Medici Palace. In Venice there came, in 1457, the end of the long and glorious 34 years' rule of the Doge Francesco Foscari, who died in that year. He was the last of her great doges. In France, in 1461, Charles VII, the king placed on the throne by Joan of Arc, died, in the same year that in England Henry VI was dethroned in favour of Edward IV. Charles was succeeded by his cowardly and treacherous son Louis XI, the royal trickster. Detestable as were his long list of murders, carried out by the most treacherous methods, he brought order out of chaos in France. Art, 1434 to 1464. The 30 years' rule of Cosimo shows us the new movement in art advancing with rapid strides to greater and greater achievements through the genius of Donatello, Fra Angelico, Luca della Robbia, Ghiberti, and Lippi. Donatello, the third in age of the four leaders of the Renaissance in art, exercised by far the deepest influence of the four. Ghiberti, Brunelleschi, and Masaccio each did their part, but Donatello infused a new spirit into the whole matter, breathing into it the breath of life. 16 years old when the new movement in art began, and living to the age of 81, he exercised for 50 years the leading influence in the world of art. We have therefore to look at him under two aspects: one, as a sculptor, and two, as a guide to the art world as to the true aim of art. 1. Donatello, the first sculptor in the round since the time of Greek art, introduced as great a revolution in sculpture as Giotto did in painting. The nature of this revolution has been well described by a recent writer of his life as follows. Quote, "In order to estimate the full significance of the new departure in sculpture inaugurated by Donatello, that sculpturing of isolated statues which had not been attempted since the last artist of antiquity laid down his chisel, it must be borne in mind that for centuries the accepted form for this art had been relief. While also sculpture had not been used as a prime vehicle by itself for conveying the artist's idea, but as an adjunct and ornament to architecture. Thus, in Orcagna's celebrated shrine in Or San Michele, in honour of the Madonna, we find the Madonna sentiment diffused throughout all its parts. A story is told by a series of reliefs. A character is suggested by a carefully thought-out arrangement of figures representing the accepted virtues of that character, appropriately placed between those stories which appear to illustrate them. Symbols are freely employed, and even the material and colours, the white marble, spangled with precious stones and mosaics, contribute their qualities to aid in the expression of the ideal associated in the mind of the artist with the personality of the Blessed Virgin. This was essentially the medieval form of art. Now, the genius of classic art was exactly the opposite of this. Where the medieval genius was diffuse, the classic genius was concentrated. Where the medieval sculptor flew to symbols to express the internal things of the supernal glory, the sculptor of the classic age, choosing the most perfect form in nature, the human, so refined and idealized it, and so transfused it with that spirit and thought desired to be expressed, that it spoke by suggestion to all who had ears to hear. Donatello's predecessors were medieval, one and all. He himself was a scholar in their school, yet, when he was only 20 years of age, and 12 years before he was admitted as a master in his guild, we see him turn his back on the entire medieval method, and choosing the way of antiquity, begin his series of isolated heroic statues." End quote. Thus did Donatello, while still quite young, feel the inspiration of that rebirth in art which was permeating all Florence, and 4 years after Ghiberti began his first pair of bronze doors, on which Donatello had worked as an assistant, this youth of 20 made that bold and independent return to earlier principles which marks the true genius. After various statues representing Joshua, Daniel, Jeremiah, Habakkuk, Abraham, St. Peter, St. Mark, the marble statue of David, and others, all intended to occupy niches on the walls of the cathedral, the campanile, or the church of Or San Michele, Donatello produced in 1416 his St. George, generally considered his masterpiece, which gave him the position of the first sculptor of his time. But Donatello was to go further than this. About the year 1432 he executed for Cosimo his bronze statue of David, and this statue introduced a new era in the art of sculpture, for it was the first isolated nude statue that had been made for more than 1,000 years. Even the St. George, besides embodying no attempt to depict the human form undraped, had only been made for a niche, but this statue of David was intended to stand in the cortile of Cosimo's palace and be looked at from every side. This remarkable innovation, as Lord Balcarres justly calls it, advanced Donatello's reputation to a still greater degree than even his St. George had done, having an immediate effect on all the sculptors of his time and spreading Donatello's fame far beyond Italy. Seeing it as we now do in the Museum of the Bargello, surrounded by many others, we are apt to forget the distinguished position which this statue holds as the leader of all that followed it in sculpture. The only others of Donatello's numerous works necessary to notice here are his statue of Judith slaying Holofernes and his medallions copied from antique gems. The Judith was executed, like the David, for the cortile of the Medici Palace, and was finished shortly after the family moved into the palace in 1440. The statue had an important history some 50 years later. See Chapter 10. The medallions, which still remain in excellent preservation over the arches of the cortile, are copies in marble of 8 antique gems, the subjects being Diomede and the Palladium, Bacchus and Ariadne, Ulysses and Athena, Daedalus and Icarus, and 4 others of minor interest. The original gems were in the Medici collection. Whether these medallions were completed and placed in position at the time when the palace was first occupied in 1440, as seems most probable, or at a later date in Cosimo's life, is a debated point. 2. But greater still is Donatello's fame as a guide to the aim which art should set before itself, a message which he taught to sculptors and painters alike. Hitherto, the aim that artists had striven after was the production of as lifelike a representation as possible of nature, and this alone they had found difficult enough. Donatello introduced a further step, teaching that form must be a mere means to an end, that of conveying some deep thought to the mind, that art, in fact, must be a language. The outward rendered expressive of the inward, the body instinct with spirit, the soul made incarnate, this, which has been said to define truth in art, was in brief Donatello's message to the art world, and it produced the great stride forward which art now took. It was, in fact, the inauguration of the whole difference between classic and modern art, the former aiming no further than to portray absolute perfection of form, the latter aiming, simultaneously with this, at conveying some message to the mind. It is this characteristic of Donatello's genius which has caused him to be called by his countrymen Il Maestro di Chi Sanno, the master of those who know. His statue of St. George, in which the ideal to which he gives expression is that of the flesh under the dominion of the spirit, is the best example of this characteristic in his art. Donatello also revived a branch of art which had been dead since the time of ancient Rome, that of casting statues, and particularly equestrian statues, in bronze, a difficult work, since all its details had, in the course of 9 centuries, become unknown. In 1453, after many difficulties, he completed for the Venetian Republic the first bronze equestrian statue executed since Roman times, that of the Venetian general Gattamelata at Padua. His works in bas-relief have also certain characteristics of their own, notably that exceedingly low relief called stiacciato, which he often used with very beautiful effect. Perkins draws attention to his treatment of the hair, saying that, though the ancient sculptures were unrivalled in their treatment of hair in the abstract, No sculptor, ancient or modern, ever surpassed Donatello in giving it all the qualities of growth and waywardness. To compare Donatello with his great successor Michelangelo is absurd. Donatello's fame is that of the leader, of the man who revolutionized sculpture and taught all who came after him what art's true aim should be, and no excellencies in Michelangelo or any other successor can touch the point on which Donatello's fame rests. Fra Angelico. San Marco not only possessed learned men among its community, and a prior who was beloved by all who knew him, but also numbered among its members the greatest painter of the day, Fra Angelico. His earlier paintings are to be seen at Cortana, but in 1437 he began his painting at Florence, being at Cosimo's insistence set to work, as soon as any portions of the new monastery were sufficiently far advanced for the purpose, to decorate the walls of the chapter house, cloisters, and corridors with his frescoes. Amongst these, the large fresco in the chapter house representing the Crucifixion, with the saints of the New Testament on one side and the prominent saints of the Middle Ages on the other, was specially ordered by Cosimo, who gave much helpful advice in regard to the details. It was one of the first of Fra Angelico's frescoes painted in San Marco. Cosimo also made Fra Angelico paint, in the cell which he kept for himself, a fresco picture of the Adoration of the Magi, desiring to have this example of Eastern kings laying down their crowns at the manger of Bethlehem always before his eyes as a reminder for his own guidance as a ruler. From time to time we meet with a master who, having made some line in art specially his own, and perfected it to such a point that it is felt that no further advance in that line is possible to man, remains for all time its solitary exponent. It was thus with Fra Angelico. He reigns supreme and alone in that line which he chose, wherein he sought only to express the inner life of the adoring soul. At the same time he was an artist who steadily improved in technical skill, and his later paintings show that he had carefully studied the works of Masaccio. Regarding the general style of his painting, Mrs. Adey says as follows, quote, "All the mystic thought of the medieval world, the passionate love of God and man that beat in the heart of St. Francis, the yearnings of Dante's soul after a higher and more perfect order of things are embodied in the art of Fra Angelico. The brilliancy of colour and richness which he gives in his pictures of angels and heavenly scenes are marvellous. In his picture at Cortona of the Annunciation, Fra Angelico's first version of his favourite subject, the angels' wings are gold-tipped with ruby light, and his robe is a marvel of decorative beauty, studded all over with little tongues of flame, and embroidered in mystic patterns. His picture of the coronation of the Virgin is one of the glories of the Louvre, and in it he has lavished the richest ornament and the most radiant colour on the angels who stand before the throne, each with a spark of fire on his forehead and glittering stars on his purple wings." End quote. Ruskin, speaking of Fra Angelico's painting from the more technical side, remarks as follows, quote, "The art of Fra Angelico, both in drawing and colouring, is perfect, and his work may be recognized at any distance by its rainbow play and brilliancy, like a piece of opal among common marbles. In order to effect clearer distinction between heavenly beings and those of this world, he represents the former as clothed in draperies of the purest colour, crowned with glories of burnished gold, and entirely shadowless. The flames on their foreheads waving brighter as they move, the sparkles streaming away from their purple wings like the glitter of the sun upon the sea, while they listen in the pauses of alternate song for the prolonging of the trumpet blast and the answering of the psalm and harp and cymbal throughout the endless deep. And from all the star-shores of heaven. This mode of treatment, combined as it is with exquisite choice of gesture and disposition of drapery, gives perhaps the best idea of spiritual beings which the human mind is capable of forming." End quote. For one other point, Fra Angelico's pictures are notable. In them we have, for the first time, heads full of individual character, while he was the first to begin introducing in his pictures portraits of his friends, thus doing much to help forward another line in art, portrait painting, which a generation later became a recognized branch of painting. In this way he gives us in his picture of the Deposition from the Cross, now in the Accademia at Florence, a portrait of his friend Michelozzo, the architect, who was being employed by Cosimo in the rebuilding of San Marco. Fra Angelico's period of painting in Florence lasted for 9 years, 1437 to 1446. In 1446, Pope Eugenius IV, having seen so much of his work at Florence, summoned him to Rome, but that pope died almost immediately afterwards in 1447. However, his successor, Nicholas V, was, as previously noted, most anxious to inaugurate a new state of things in Rome as regards art. One of his first efforts in this direction, after the example of the monastery of San Marco in Florence, was to begin covering the walls of the Vatican with frescoes, and this was the commencement of that long series of renowned frescoes which, added to by pope after pope, now form so large a part of the treasures of the Vatican. Nicholas V began with his private chapel and set Fra Angelico to work to decorate its walls. Thus, these frescoes in the chapel of Nicholas V are important both as the first of all the frescoes in the Vatican and also as being Fra Angelico's last work. They took him the greater part of the next 5 years, 1447 to 1452, and these frescoes in particular show how greatly he had profited by careful study of Masaccio's works, for while they still have his own grace and skill in delineating character, they are instinct with Masaccio's power. In them we have from Fra Angelico's 2 portraits of Nicholas V, in the 2 pictures representing Sixtus II, AD 257, ordaining the deacon St. Lawrence and giving into his charge the treasures of the church, Fra Angelico died at Rome in 1455. Simultaneously with the above work in art, Nicholas V commenced the formation of a library in the Vatican after the pattern of the Medici Library in Florence, and collected a large number of manuscript books, and appointed a librarian, but the whole was dispersed by his successors, and it was not until Sixtus IV revived the institution in 1475 that the Vatican Library began its existence. Luca della Robbia. Luca della Robbia, born in 1400, was employed as a youth on the bronze doors of the baptistery. After a time he began working on his own account, and struck out a new line of his own. He executed reliefs in marble, in bronze, and in glazed terracotta, devoting him specially to the varied expressions of the human features, and his works, by their truth to nature and the deep feeling which they breathe, have won for him an honoured place amongst those who gave an impulse to the Renaissance. Speaking of his art generally, Miss Crutwell says, quote, "He is first of all the imaginative sculptor and poet, who embodied the grandest ideals in forms worthy of Phidian Greece." Unquote. In 1438, Luca produced his beautiful relief of the Cantoria, executed for one of the organ lofts of the cathedral, and representing groups of boys and girls singing and little children dancing, which at once placed him amongst the foremost artists of his time. This relief in marble, from its truth to nature and the grace of movement of its figures, was almost as much a wonder to the time as Ghiberti's first pair of bronze doors had been, and had much effect in helping still further forward both sculpture and painting towards a lifelike representation of human figures. It is meant to illustrate the 150th Psalm, each of the panels portraying one of the 6 verses of that psalm. Regarding this magnificent frieze, the Marchese Berlamacci says, Quote, Luca della Robbia's cantori, children, live and move. The very action of their throats can be seen as they sing. The soul of music is in their faces. There is a swing in their movements as they dance, a grace of attitude, and an elegance of flowing drapery that throughout the works of the Renaissance has never been surpassed. End quote. Besides the Cantoria, Luca della Robbia's other chief works, in marble and bronze, were the 5 panels on the north side of the Campanile, executed in 1439, representing the development of man's intellect in the arts and sciences. The tomb of Benozzo Federighi, Bishop of Fiesole, now in the church of Santa Trinita, executed in 1454, and by some considered Luca's best work in marble, and the bronze doors of the sacristy of the Duomo, completed after many years' labour in 1469. His works in glazed terracotta will be considered later. Chapter 6. Ghiberti. In 1452, 6 years after Brunelleschi had died, and Fra Angelico's painting in Florence come to an end, Ghiberti at last finished his second pair of bronze doors for the baptistery. These, which Michelangelo 100 years later declared fit to be the gates of paradise, are considered Ghiberti's masterpiece. They represent scenes from Old Testament history, and Ruskin remarks, "The book of Genesis, in all the fullness of its incidents, in all the depths of its meaning, is bound within the leaf borders of the gates of Ghiberti." They had taken Ghiberti 28 years. He had begun his first pair of doors at the age of 23, he finished his second at the age of 73, and he died 3 years afterwards. Excepting his 3 statues outside Or San Michele, and 1 or 2 minor works, these 2 pairs of bronze doors were his life's work. As Alexandre Dumas says, a whole life spent over this marvellous bronze. The pathos of the young Ghiberti beginning this beautiful work of art when full of youth and strength, amidst all the enthusiasm of the first outburst of the Renaissance, and finishing it when he was old and worn with years, and when so many who had seen its commencement had passed away, cannot but touch all who think of it. It was another generation who now saw its completion from that which had seen it begun. Cosimo himself, now 63, had then been only a boy of 13. Fra Angelico 15, Michelozzo 11, Luca della Robbia, a child of a year old. Masaccio, the boy who had worked under him, had covered himself with glory in another line, and was long dead. Brunelleschi, his passionate rival, had had time to learn another art, and to make his name famous therein, and was gone. Of all the band of eager competitors for the work, he alone remained. As we look at these beautiful doors, how many thoughts crowd upon us. The terrible sufferings of Florence from the plague which caused their construction, the celebrated competition with its intense and passionate rivalry, the whole lifetime of work spent in their production, all the art life which surged around them as they lay gradually taking shape in the workshop of Ghiberti, hard by the place where they have now stood for 450 years, the school of art which that workshop began for Florence, the band of eager young assistants, some of whom had since made their names, which are now famous throughout the world, the final triumph when they were at last completed, the solemn function when they were erected in their place. The grey-haired man of 73, bent with age, who had begun them in his youth, and who, had he had another lifetime before him, would have destroyed even these, and begun yet another effort after something more perfect still, the pride of all who had had a part, however humble in their production, the excitement and rapture of a whole city. Lastly, the many things of which they were the origin and the matrix, the sculpture of Donatello, the painting of Masaccio, and all that grew from these, so that we look at Ghiberti's panels, we see mirrored in them the triumphs of Raphael and of Michelangelo. It is thoughts such as these which force themselves upon our minds as we stand in the crowded modern thoroughfare with its trams and tourists and life of the Florence of today around us, and look at Ghiberti's doors. In 1441, Filippo Lippi, who had been Masaccio's pupil, finished his painting of the Coronation of the Madonna, considered his best picture in Florence. A greater contrast could scarcely be found than that between the two chief painters of Cosimo's time, Fra Angelico and Filippo Lippi, for Lippi was in everything the antithesis of his contemporary Fra Angelico. The orphan son of a butcher, he was left as a boy in charge of an aunt, who, finding him an idle ne'er-do-well, put him as a novice into the nearest monastic community, that of the Carmelites, in whose church of the Carmine Masaccio was then painting his frescoes. The monks, owing to his laziness, could do nothing with him, but, watching Masaccio at his work, Lippi thought this an easier task than learning to read and write, and Masaccio, finding he could draw, taught him his art. Lippi was 16 when Masaccio died, and in the following year, Vasari says, Lippi boldly threw off the monastic habit and took to painting for a livelihood. Though he signs himself Frate Philippus, he had no right to the term, as he had entirely discarded his vows, and owing to his disreputable conduct, no religious community would own him. His life was a disturbed one, as his drunken character and constant feuds upon those who employed him caused him to be always in trouble. After being several times brought up before the authorities for various misdemeanours, at length for a particularly flagrant case of embezzlement he was flogged. Lippi's character, however, only affected his credit as a painter by accounting for the kind of success he achieved. He had, as was to be expected, no ears for the message which Donatello was at this time teaching, and consequently his pictures on religious subjects have an exceedingly mundane character. Nevertheless, the sweet seriousness of his Madonnas falls in no way short of those of Fra Angelico, and the faces of his children are full of a quaint, mischievous character, which is delightful, while in both drawing and colouring he shows the immense advance which had now taken place in painting. And it is here that Lippi's true claim to fame lies. Masaccio, the only man who up to that time had found out the true methods of the art of painting, had died too soon himself to be able to make known his discovery, except to the few who could visit Florence and the Branacci chapel. It was left for Lippi, the rough boy whom he had taught, to show the world Masaccio's discovery. And Lippi did so. Vasari says, taught as he had been by Masaccio, he was a faithful follower of Masaccio's style, and he adds that he followed the latter's methods so faithfully that it appeared that the spirit of Masaccio had entered Lippi's body. Thus, what Masaccio had done for the art of painting is chiefly to be seen by a comparison of Lippi's pictures with those of Masaccio's immediate predecessors, the Giotteschi. Lippi's principal picture in Florence is his Coronation of the Virgin, painted for Cosimo, and now in the Accademia delle Belle Arti. But his best work is considered to be his frescoes in the cathedral at Prato, painted between 1456 and 1465. A serious error of the last generation has caused much injustice to Masaccio, and has been widely spread through Robert Browning's poem on Lippi. He makes Lippi speak of Masaccio as a youngster, then just learning to paint. Lippi saying that after his death this Guidi may perhaps rob him of his laurels. This is owing to Masaccio's date being in Browning's time, imagined to be later than it really is, so that Lippi was supposed to have preceded him, with the result that Lippi, instead of Masaccio, gained all the credit of the great advance in painting which exists between the Giotteschi and Masaccio. The pathos which throughout attaches to Masaccio is thus still further increased. Not only is he crushed with poverty throughout his life, and his great fame only won after death, but in addition even those laurels are in later times given to the pupil, whom he had out of a rough kindness taught for nothing. And then, as the crowning point, this Tommaso Guidi, this great genius who is the founder of all modern painting, and from whom even Raphael was glad to learn, becomes known to posterity only as Clumsy Tom. The fuller information now available has put this matter right, and more particularly the registers of the catasto tax for the years 1421 to 1428, which give definite and conclusive evidence as to Masaccio's date and circumstances, though even without this, Vasari's remark should have sufficed to prevent the mistake. Lippi died in 1469 at the age of 57. Minor sculptors. Though the transcendent genius of Donatello threw all others into the shade, there were various other distinguished sculptors who also flourished at this period, making Cosimo's time specially notable in this branch of art. The chief of these were Desiderio da Settignano, a pupil of Donatello and eminent among the sculptors of this time. Perkins considers his tomb of Carlo Masupini in Santa Croce as one of the 3 finest tombs in Tuscany, while he says of the bust of Marietta Palastrozzi, quote, "It would be difficult to point out a bust which more thoroughly combines those peculiar features of the best Quattrocento work, high technical excellence, refinement of taste, delicacy of treatment, and purity of design." Unquote. The beautiful head of St. Cecilia in Stiacciato, low relief, now the property of Lord Weems, which used to be attributed to Donatello, is now said to be by Desiderio. Bernardo and Antonio Rossellino. Bernardo Rossellino executed the fine tomb of Leonardo Bruni in Santa Croce, and the monument of Beata Villana in the Rucellai chapel in Santa Maria Novella. Of Antonio Rossellino, Perkins says, quote, "He possessed grace, delicacy of treatment, dignity, and a rare feeling of beauty and sweetness of expression, as we see in the noble monument of the Cardinal Portagallo at San Miniato, Florence." Unquote. He considers this tomb one of the most beautiful in Italy. Mino da Fiesole, another still more famous sculptor of this period, who outlived those previously mentioned. His works show a refined taste, great delicacy of detail, and much devotional feeling. Regarding his tomb of Bishop Salutati in the Cathedral of Fiesole, Perkins says, quote, "The bust of the bishop is certainly one of the most living and strongly characterized counterfeit presentments of nature ever produced in marble." Unquote. Mino da Fiesole also executed the beautiful tabernacle in the Medici Chapel at Santa Croce, and many busts, altarpieces, and other celebrated works during the time of Piero il Gottoso and Lorenzo the Magnificent. Antonio and Piero Pollajuolo. These 2 brothers were celebrated sculptors, painters, goldsmiths, and medallists of the time. Their renown belongs almost entirely to Antonio, his younger brother Piero producing little notable work. Antonio's principal existing work in Florence is the silver altar of the baptistry, kept in the Opera del Duomo, and in Rome his 2 tombs of Pope Sixtus IV and Pope Innocent VIII. The fine medal of the Pazzi conspiracy, hitherto attributed to him, is now said to be by Bertoldo, the well-known pupil of Donatello. Antonio Pollajuolo was no less celebrated as a painter than as a sculptor and medallist. In 1460, 3 large and very famous canvases, 5 braccia high, about 9 feet, were painted by him for the hall of the Medici Palace, depicting the combats of Hercules with the lion, with the Hydra, and with Antaeus. Vasari describes them in detail and speaks with great admiration of their execution. When the Medici Palace was sacked in 1494, they were appropriated by the Signoria and removed to the council hall of the Palazzo della Signoria, where they hung for many years, but have since been lost. Vasari, in mentioning them, states that they were painted for Lorenzo the Magnificent, but this must be a mistake on his part, for in a letter of Pollajuolo's own he states that he painted them in 1460, and at that time Cosimo was head of the house, and his grandson Lorenzo a boy of only 11 years old, so that they were painted for Cosimo. There were 2 small panel pictures on the same subject by Pollajuolo, now in the Uffizi Gallery, evidently painted about the same time, and these give us an idea of what the celebrated canvases which adorned the walls of the principal reception room of the Medici Palace in the time of Cosimo, Piero, and Lorenzo were like. Cosimo, 1463 to 1464. Cosimo grew old very rapidly, suffering severely from gout, and in his later years becoming very infirm, which caused him to leave the home affairs of the state to a very large extent to others, a condition of things under which we first hear of the incapable Luca Pitti, who during the last 4 years of Cosimo's life thrust himself into a prominent place in public matters, though Cosimo still kept foreign affairs in his own hands. His long labours for his country's welfare had borne their full fruit. None now questioned or attempted to disturb the position he had so deservedly gained. We find the Signoria in an official document, a letter to the Venetian Republic, calling him Capo della Repubblica, though he held no official position at the time, and head of the Republic he was universally acknowledged to be to the very end of his life. Giovanni. Cosimo, like his father, had 2 sons, Piero, born in 1416, and Giovanni, born in 1421. The death of the latter at the age of 42 is the last prominent incident connected with Cosimo's life. Giovanni had all the family love of learning, and many rare manuscript books collected by him are still in the Medici Library in San Lorenzo. His portrait bust, by Mino da Fiesole, who knew him well, gives us a thoroughly reliable representation of his appearance. As the chronic ill health of his elder brother Piero made it unlikely that the latter would survive their father, Giovanni was brought up as the future head of the family, was looked on by all as his father's successor, and was Cosimo's favourite son. To a family situated as the Medici were at this time, it was of the utmost importance that whoever succeeded Cosimo as head of the house should be both capable and popular, so that Cosimo's feeling regarding his 2 sons was not unnatural. Nor did Giovanni come short of his father's hopes in this respect. His ability, good sense, tact, and knowledge of men made him highly popular, and he promised to be a worthy successor to Cosimo. So, as Piero's health grew from year to year worse, all the hopes of the family rested on Giovanni. The latter was married to Ginevra degli Albizzi, one of that family who had so violently opposed Cosimo in his earlier years, and tried to compass his ruin and death. Giovanni and Ginevra's only child, a son, then 9 years old, died in 1461. But, alas for human hopes! In 1463, 1 year before Cosimo's own death, Giovanni, the hope of the house, died. The grief into which the family were plunged at this serious misfortune was very great. Cosimo was broken down, physically helpless, and his death soon to be expected. Piero was likely to die any day, and his eldest son, Lorenzo, was only 14 years old. So that with Giovanni dead, it seemed that all the prospects of the family were destroyed. For it was well known that powerful enemies, including all those other families jealous of the one which was rising to such eminence, were on the watch for an opportunity to bring its power to an end. There is a pathetic story of the infirm and aged Cosimo after this death of his favourite son, having himself carried through the rooms of the spacious palace which he had built, and which had seen 2 such gaps made in the family within 3 years, and several times repeating, "Too large a house now for so small a family." Giovanni was buried in the family church of San Lorenzo, which was then just finished, and had been endowed by Cosimo. Giovanni de Medici and Piccarda had already been buried in the old sacristy, and their grandson, the second Giovanni, was now also interned there. And when, 6 years later, his brother Piero died, the sculptor Verrocchio, Donatello's best pupil, was called upon to design a joint tomb for the 2 brothers, and executed the very tasteful one which stands in the archway between the sacristy and the chapel of the Madonna, consisting of a sarcophagus of porphyry with bronze acanthus leaves climbing over it. It is Verrocchio's earliest important work. Cosimo, 1464. Cosimo died on the 1st of August 1464 at his beloved villa of Careggi at the age of 75. Piero, in relating their grandfather's death to his 2 sons the following day, says as follows, quote, "He counselled me that, as you had good abilities, I ought to bring you up well, and you would then relieve me of many cares. He said that he did not wish any pomp or demonstration at his funeral. He reminded me, as he had told me before, of where he wished to be buried, in San Lorenzo, and he said all in such an orderly manner, and with so much prudence and spirit, that it was wonderful. He added that his life had been long, therefore he was well content to leave it when God willed. Yesterday morning he had himself completely dressed. He then made his confession to the prior of San Lorenzo, after which he caused Mass to be said, making the responses as if he were in health. Afterwards, being asked to make profession of his faith, he said the creed word for word, said the confession himself, and then received the Holy Sacrament, doing so with as much devotion as one can describe, having first asked pardon of every one for any wrongs he had done them, which things have encouraged me in my hope towards God." Unquote. Cosimo's popularity with his countrymen lasted to the very end, as well as the respect with which he was regarded by the rulers of all other states. He was buried as he had desired without any pomp, and at first in the old sacristy of San Lorenzo. The Signoria had planned to give him a magnificent funeral and a very imposing monument, but the Medici family, on the proposal being put before them, refused to have either. The people, however, were determined to give him some special honour. A public decree was therefore passed by the Signoria, conferring on him the title of Pater Patriae, and ordering that this should be inscribed by the Republic on his tomb. It therefore bears the honourable inscription, Cosimus Medicis hic situs est, decreto publico Pater Patriae. No greater honour could have been done him than that such a title should thus be given him after his death, and by this title of Pater Patriae he has ever since been known in history. But the honour done to Cosimo's memory was not confined to giving him the title of Father of his country. A further and more peculiar honour was conferred. San Lorenzo, founded in such ancient times, is the Ambrosian Basilica, having beneath its high altar many highly venerated relics of the martyrs, and an ancient rule of the Catholic Church prohibited, out of reverence thereto, the burial of any persons in such basilicas, only permitting them to be buried in sacristies or chapels attached to the church. And although, in special cases, persons of importance were allowed to be buried in the vault below the church, none so interred were permitted to have a tombstone in the church, but their tombstones were required to be placed in the vault. There are consequently no tombstones in the pavement of the nave of San Lorenzo except one. This solitary exception is in the case of Cosimo Pater Patriae. Migliore, in his interesting old book entitled Firenze, Città Nobilissima, 1684, in describing the church of San Lorenzo, gives the following account of this matter. Quote, "And here is to be seen maintained a most laudable disposition of the canons of the church, especially at the Council of Braganza, held in Portugal under Giovanni III, which is not to allow the burial of the dead in the basilica, out of reverence to the relics of the blessed martyrs. And in accordance with this disposition, you find at the foot of the altar, in the middle of the pavement, placed in the memory of Cosimo, Padre della Patria, the marble memorial in a circle of serpentine and porphyry, with the arms of the Medici at the four sides. But the body is not in the place which is thus represented, but is placed beneath in the vault, with all the other personages buried in that church, without any description of them in the pavement above them. This was a sign of the difference which ought to be maintained between them, and him who was like a founder of this church, also as a man who, much separated from the crowd, had no equal in those happy times when the fame of worthy persons travelled upon the wings of fortune, so that one who well knew his qualities sums up all by saying, Vir potens famosus in toto mundo, a man most able, famous in all the world. None, added Il Volterrano, in public affairs of such capacity, nor in learning, wisdom, and knowledge his equal." Unquote. After dilating on all that Cosimo did for the Republic and Italy, the account concludes by saying, quote, "After his death, the Republic conferred on him the honourable title of Pater Patriae, never before conferred on any one in that Republic, and rarely even in that of Rome, and this was accompanied by extraordinary pomp at the sole cost of the Republic, in transferring his body to this sepulchre, which brought to mind that given to Fabius Maximus." Unquote. And if we penetrate into the vault below, we find in what a peculiar way this special honour to Cosimo was carried out. Evidently the Florentines were determined to do nothing by halves in the matter, for instead of finding, as we should have expected, a sarcophagus with Cosimo's name on it, placed in the vault underneath the memorial slab in the pavement of the church, we find immediately below the porphyry slab a large square pillar of about 8 feet on each side, extending right up to the floor of the church above, and having on it only the Medici arms and one short Latin inscription of 5 words, simply stating that Piero has placed this to the memory of his father. This pillar is Cosimo's tomb. His own name does not appear on it at all. That is borne by the porphyry slab above, the whole being thus joined together in one monument. It was an honour never, then or afterwards, accorded to any one else in Florence, and thus is Cosimo, after all in reality, buried in front of the high altar of San Lorenzo. An immense amount has been written on Cosimo's character, and as usual in the case of the Medici, the most violently opposite views have been enunciated. Those with whom the name of Medici overthrows all balance can see in him no virtues. Thus, even a comparatively temperate writer like Symonds, who is far surpassed by others on that side, calls Cosimo a cynical, self-seeking bourgeois tyrant. But Symonds would have found it hard to substantiate his string of epithets out of the facts of Cosimo's life. Other writers declare that every seeming virtue in Cosimo was assumed for some unworthy end, but there are many facts of Cosimo's life which decline to accord with this assertion. Nor, had it been true, could Marsilio Ficino have written, "I owe to Plato much, to Cosimo no less. He realized for me the virtues of which Plato gave me the conception." Symonds and other writers accuse Cosimo of having undermined the liberties of Florence, but the changes introduced by him in the form of the Constitution were few and unimportant. The truth was that Florence, notwithstanding her republican forms, had never really possessed freedom, and that the people, wearied of perpetual dissensions, strife, banishments, and the losses which these entailed, welcomed the stable and efficient government which Cosimo gave them. Had it not been so, his rule, resting solely on popularity, would promptly have been terminated. There was, however, in Florentine politics a Medician party and an anti-Medician party, and the latter put forward assertions, quite regardless of whether these had any solid basis, which in later times have formed the ground of unbalanced judgments and exaggerated statements which have been repeated by one writer after another, as though they expressed the acknowledged verdict of history. And at the hands of such writers Cosimo has fared ill indeed. His arduous labours for the welfare of the state and people have been declared due solely to personal ambition. The far-sighted statesmanship by which he managed to control for so long a period the destinies of his country, and to guide her affairs with such success, has been declared to have been merely a crafty plan, pursued with the utmost dissimulation, to pave the way towards the destruction of the Republic. Deeds of his done purely for the benefit of the people have been either dismissed as of little importance, or else attributed to sinister motives. Lastly, even the title placed upon his tomb by his countrymen has been represented as a mere empty compliment, though compliments are seldom thought necessary when the person no longer survives to hear them. All this, however, involves the assumption that an exceptionally quick-witted race, specially on the watch against attempts to steal away their independence, should in this one instance, and throughout so long a period as 30 years, have displayed a want of discernment at variance with all their history. Machiavelli's estimate of Cosimo is as follows, quote, "He was one of the most prudent of men, grave and courteous, and of venerable appearance. His early years were full of trouble, exile, and personal danger, but by the unwearied generosity of his disposition he triumphed over all his enemies, and made himself most popular with the people. Though so rich, yet in his mode of living he was always very simple, and without ostentation. None of his time had such an intimate knowledge of government and of state affairs. Hence, even in a city so given to change, he retained the government for 30 years. Unquote. Unwearied generosity of disposition exactly expresses the general idea which is given us by the facts of Cosimo's life as the most prominent feature of his character. And setting aside all testimony of writers on the one side or the other, the indisputable benefits which he conferred on his country, the end which he put to faction fighting which sapped Florence's strength, the prosperity and the contentment which he secured for the people, the relief from taxation which he brought about by the effects of his unenlightened foreign policy, and lastly, the general character associated with his memory in the minds of the common people of Tuscany, all go to refute the unbalanced judgments which have been referred to, and to corroborate those who have considered that the title engraved by his countrymen upon his tomb was justly deserved, and correctly sums up the leading features of his character and conduct.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.